Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal exciting details for the week ahead from July 28 to August 1, 2025. First, the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for months finally erupted in a blaze of betrayal and heartbreak, as Willow found herself shattered by the cruel truth of Nina and Drew's secret affair. The fragile thread of trust that she had slowly begun weaving with her biological mother was instantly severed, and the man she had once envisioned a future with now stood exposed as nothing more than a master of deception. The pain was visceral, coursing through her like fire as she stood in the wedding gown meant to represent hope, only to realize she had been nothing but a pawn in the games of those closest to her. Everything unraveled before her eyes, from the neatly arranged flower petals down the aisle to the whispered blessings that no longer held any meaning. It was not just about infidelity, it was the humiliation of being betrayed by both a lover and a mother, in one swift, unsparing stroke. Nina, for her part, was spiraling into a hell of her own design. She had spent so long trying to rebuild her relationship with Willow, to piece together a semblance of maternal redemption after years of loss and missteps, only to see everything crumble in a matter of moments. Her desperation was palpable as she tried to justify, to reason, to plead for understanding, but Willow's expression was carved from stone, unyielding and wounded. The image of her daughter walking away, not just from the altar, but from her life, was far more painful than she had prepared for. Nina had crossed a line that could not be undone, not merely by apologizing or offering explanations. In betraying Willow's trust, she had confirmed every suspicion, every fear, every barrier that had once stood between them. And now, the gaping silence between mother and daughter was louder than any outburst ever could be. Meanwhile, Drew's carefully maintained facade was crumbling with each passing second. He had believed he could contain the fallout, that the truth could be delayed or diluted, but reality had hit with the force of a tidal wave. His entanglement with Nina had always been laced with danger, not only emotionally but logistically, given his deeper ties to secrets that reached far beyond any personal affair. His manipulation of Portia and Curtis, his efforts to cover up old WSB connections, and now his role in destabilizing Willow's life were all converging into a reckoning that he could no longer avoid. Even if he had tried to salvage his relationship with Willow, there was no ground left to stand on. His image as a protector, a reliable partner, had shattered into shards of betrayal and self-interest, leaving him exposed to judgment not only from Willow but from the entire community that once respected him. As Britt's mysterious return began to ripple through Port Charles, so did the questions she carried with her. Thought to be dead, she had vanished under suspicious circumstances, and now her reappearance was more than a personal miracle, it was a threat. Britt had not come back empty-handed. Alongside her was a young girl whose paternity remained hidden, a child whose identity could unravel more secrets than anyone was prepared for. Speculation spread rapidly about whether this was her daughter, possibly fathered by someone still operating within Port Charles's inner circles. More dangerously, Britt had recovered classified documents that tied Drew to a covert mission involving WSB operatives, suggesting that his actions weren't simply reckless but orchestrated as part of a far-reaching agenda. These revelations, if brought to light, would not only destroy Drew's career but implicate Nina as well, given her proximity to the entire operation. With Drew scrambling to suppress the leaks and Nina pleading to reclaim what little family she had left, Willow stood at the center of the storm, paralyzed by heartbreak and confusion. Her instinct told her to run, to flee the chaos and start over somewhere new, away from the lies, the manipulations, the endless betrayals. But guilt weighed heavily on her. Scout, Danny, and other innocents were tangled in this web of adult recklessness, and walking away might feel like liberation but would also mean abandoning those who relied on her strength. Still, the pain was too much to bear. The wedding was cancelled, not with a public announcement, but through the hollow silence of a bride who never walked down the aisle. The guests quietly dispersed, each one burdened with their own assumptions, but Willow disappeared, leaving only a note behind. No one knew where she had gone, only that she was no longer willing to be the collateral damage in other people's wars. Amid the fallout, Liesel began connecting dots of her own. She had always suspected that Britt's disappearance wasn't as simple as it seemed, and now with her daughter back, disoriented but defiant, Liesl unearthed connections between Drew, Victor, and a clandestine network that had used Britt as bait in a failed black market cloning project. These ties explain Drew's desperate desire to suppress the truth and his sudden intimacy with Nina, who may have also been pulled into the scheme long before she realized it. If Britt's daughter was, in fact, a clone or subject of experimentation, then the threat was far greater than emotional scandal, it was scientific exploitation. Liesl, furious and galvanized, vowed to burn down anyone who had touched her family, setting her sights on Drew, Nina, and anyone shielding them. Her alliance with Britt marked the beginning of a new, sharper campaign of vengeance. Simultaneously, Martin unearthed a letter Monica had written before her death, revealing that she had discovered Drew was not who he claimed to be. The implications were staggering. Not only did Drew manipulate everyone in his orbit, but he may never have been the real Drew Kane to begin with. The person parading around under that name had accessed classified WSB credentials, infiltrated Aurora Media, and exploited Nina's grief for strategic gain. The letter, however, had been partially destroyed, clearly tampered with by someone who knew the truth was close to being exposed. Martin, unsure who to trust, kept the remnants hidden while deciding who deserved to know. What was once a romantic scandal now became a conspiracy capable of consuming every institution in Port Charles, and Willow's disappearance only added fuel to suspicions that she was either a target or a key to unraveling everything. In the final hours of the week, as Britt stood on the roof of General Hospital with the child by her side and the city's skyline bleeding orange into dusk, she understood the war had only just begun. Willow's pain had been real, Nina's desperation had been sincere, and Drew's betrayal had been absolute. But the truth, the deepest, most horrifying truth, was still buried in layers of false identities, scientific perversions, and broken loyalties. Somewhere in the shadows, another player had been orchestrating all of this, someone with access to both the past and future. And as the lights below began to flicker on one by one, Britt promised herself she would uncover the full scope of what had been done, not just for her daughter, or for Willow, or for herself, but for every life desecrated in the name of control. The reckoning was coming, and no one would be spared. Second, Isaiah had always kept his cabin far outside the city for a reason, tucked deep in the woods where phone signals faded and silence reigned. It was never just a retreat from his fast-paced life in Port Charles, it was a place for isolation, for disappearing when the noise of the world grew too loud. But now, as he sped down the winding roads leading toward that remote sanctuary, it was clear he wasn't simply escaping stress or chasing peace. Something unspoken had driven him out of town, and his decision to leave coincided too precisely with the implosion of the most anticipated wedding in Port Charles. The fact that the camera kept cutting back to Isaiah in motion, his tense grip on the steering wheel, the haunted glances in his rearview mirror, suggested that he wasn't just running from the city. He was heading towards something, or perhaps someone, whether he admitted it to himself or not. Back in Port Charles, the wedding that was supposed to unite Drew and Willow had turned into a storm of betrayal and humiliation. Willow, blindsided by the revelation of Drew's secret affair with Nina, found herself emotionally unmoored, drowning in the ruins of trust and love. It wasn't just the collapse of a relationship, it was the unmasking of every lie that had kept her anchored. For someone like Willow, who had spent her life trying to rebuild broken pieces into something resembling hope, the emotional devastation was too great to process in the public eye. And so, in the chaos following her exit from the ceremony, the idea of escape took root in her heart. Whether intentional or instinctual, her steps began to follow the very path Isaiah had taken, though neither of them yet realized their journeys would intersect in the same secluded place. The cabin, a symbol of solitude and recovery, suddenly became a potential collision point for two lives unraveling in different ways. If Willow did reach that cabin, whether by memory, suggestion, or sheer fate, it would mark a turning point not only in her own healing but in Isaiah's as well. He had secrets of his own, buried in the silence of the trees, and he hadn't expected to confront them with a witness. But should Willow arrive, raw from betrayal and desperate for stillness, the cabin would no longer be a sanctuary for one. Instead, it would become the setting for new emotional reckonings, long overdue confessions, and perhaps even a strange sense of refuge that neither of them had been seeking, but both might desperately need. While Isaiah wrestled with the quiet turmoil brewing inside him, Drew was rapidly descending into a darker version of himself. Humiliated in front of friends, family, and most importantly, Willow, Drew could not allow the destruction of his wedding to pass without consequence. His mind, once focused on business deals and media power plays, began to twist toward revenge. Curtis, who had tried to do the right thing by warning Willow of the truth, suddenly became Drew's prime suspect in the unraveling of his perfect day. The very man who had once been an ally was now seen as a traitor, and Drew's wrath would be both personal and strategic. Curtis might have expected backlash, but not the level of retribution Drew was preparing to unleash. Drew's fury didn't stop at Curtis. Portia, loyal to her husband and unwilling to lie for Drew's benefit, had resisted the pressure to falsify medical records against Michael. That defiance had made her another target. And Nina, Nina, was no longer simply a co-conspirator or a fleeting mistake. In Drew's eyes, she had become the root of everything, the woman who tempted him down a path that destroyed everything he claimed to cherish. Where once he saw vulnerability and shared loss in her, now he saw manipulation and weakness. His love for her had evaporated the moment Willow turned away, and what was left was a cold desire to ensure that no one walked away unscathed. As Drew began to plot, Portia could sense the darkness rising around him. She had seen enough in her years at General Hospital to recognize the signs of a man spiraling toward vengeance. Her instincts told her to warn Curtis, to protect her family, but even she wasn't sure where Drew's revenge would land first. What she did know was that he was capable of more than people gave him credit for. The man who had once hidden secrets from the WSB, who had used media power to manipulate public perception, was not above using lies, blackmail, or even force to punish those who dared cross him. And with his ego bruised and his heart in pieces, Drew's sense of morality had gone numb. Meanwhile, Nina had begun to unravel in a different way. While Drew blamed her, Nina blamed herself. She had tried to create a future from broken pieces, love born out of grief, connection born from secrecy. Now, that fragile future had turned to ash in her hands. She feared that she had not only lost Drew, but any chance at redemption with Willow. The betrayal had been too deep, too public, too raw. And as she stood alone in the aftermath, Nina began to realize that Drew's silence wasn't passive, it was dangerous. If he had turned on Curtis and Portia, there was no reason to think she would be spared. Her only option now was to brace herself, knowing full well that Drew could become someone she no longer recognized. As Drew's list of enemies grew, Isaiah's cabin, once untouched by the city's politics and betrayals, was slowly drawing its own storm. Isaiah, unaware of the drama he might walk into, was carrying his own burdens and trauma to that place. If Willow reached the cabin first, Isaiah would find not peace but complication. If he arrived before her, he might be given the chance to either reopen old wounds or offer quiet understanding. Either way, the cabin was no longer just a hiding place, it was a crossroads. A meeting ground for the broken and betrayed, a space where revenge might stall and reflection might begin. In a town where secrets never stayed buried and pain always resurfaced, the isolation of the woods might offer what the city never could, a moment of truth. And that moment was coming faster than anyone expected. Third, in the relentless shadow of revenge, Jens Sidwell was never the kind of man to let go of a grudge, especially not one involving Sonny Corinthos, whose influence and arrogance had long cast a dark cloud over the criminal underworld. The recent negotiation that led to the release of Marco Rios had left Sidwell publicly humbled, forced to acquiesce to Sonny's terms in a tense and bitter standoff. But deep beneath his measured exterior, resentment burned with volcanic intensity. Sidwell knew that patience was the most lethal weapon in his arsenal, and while Sonny might believe the deal had secured peace, he had unknowingly triggered the countdown to a far more dangerous reprisal. Sidwell didn't see Marco's rescue as a loss. He saw it as the opening move of a long, brutal endgame. For Sonny, the illusion of control was his addiction. He believed that dominance could silence threats, that fear alone could bend the will of men like Sidwell. But what Sonny had failed to recognize was that he had struck a blow not against a rival, but against a man with nothing left to lose. Sidwell was prepared to dismantle Sonny's empire not through brute force, but by cutting through his heart, his family. And that was precisely where the real danger began to take root. As Sonny turned his focus toward rebuilding what the Marco affair had shaken, he remained oblivious to the silent war creeping closer, a war that would not announce itself with gunfire but with the slow unraveling of every person he held dear. Nowhere was this vulnerability more apparent than in the web of complications growing between Ava Jerome and Cody Bell. The two had danced around a fragile alliance built on mistrust and undeniable chemistry, but beneath that surface was a ticking time bomb. Cody's original mission had been simple, even cold: seduce Christina Corinthos Davis to extract leverage over Sonny. It was a tactic born from calculation, designed by handlers who knew exactly how to weaponize intimacy. But in classic tragic fashion, the plan began to collapse the moment Cody's emotions became tangled with his target. Christina's resilience, her idealism, and her fierce loyalty to her family struck chords Cody hadn't anticipated. What began as manipulation now felt dangerously close to something real, and that made Cody unstable, unpredictable, and ultimately, a liability. Ava, meanwhile, remained unaware of Cody's deeper intentions, but her instincts as a survivor whispered warnings she couldn't quite articulate. She felt herself being drawn into Cody's orbit, not just physically, but emotionally. There was a restlessness in him that mirrored her own, a shadowy past clashing with present vulnerabilities. And in those quiet moments when their eyes locked, Ava questioned the wisdom of letting her guard down. She was no stranger to betrayal or masks worn too well, and something about Cody's transformation from Sonny's stooge to sensitive confidant made her wary. Still, the loneliness, the lingering guilt, and the thirst for something unscripted pulled her closer to him, against her better judgment. Christina, caught in the middle of Cody's internal crisis, had no idea that her growing affection for him was born from a scheme far more sinister than flirtation. She had opened her world to him, shared dreams and fears in moments she had never offered so freely to anyone else. To her, Cody was a chaotic kind of comfort, a man with demons but also with tenderness. What she didn't know was that each touch, each intimate glance, had once been rehearsed, engineered to breach her defenses. But the more Cody tried to pull away from the plan, the more he realized the damage had already been done. If he confessed, he'd lose her trust forever. If he stayed silent, he'd remain complicit in the very betrayal that had already begun to haunt him. Sidwell, always 10 steps ahead, had no intention of pulling Cody out of the equation. In fact, he viewed Cody's unraveling feelings as a benefit. Emotional chaos bred mistakes, and mistakes opened new doors. By allowing Cody to entangle himself with both Christina and Ava, Sidwell could splinter Sonny's world from the inside, slowly poisoning relationships that had once served as his emotional foundation. The irony was delicious to Sidwell. Sonny, the master manipulator, being undone not by violence, but by love corrupted. And if Sonny tried to strike back, he would find that the people he once protected now carried daggers forged by their own disillusionment and heartbreak. As the days passed, Sonny began to sense a shift he couldn't quite explain. His once loyal network felt thinner, more brittle. The air around him was charged with suspicion. Ava's glances lingered too long. Cody's jokes had lost their edge. Even Christina seemed distant, confused by a tension she couldn't name. The fortress he had built over decades now echoed with unfamiliar silence, and Sonny knew instinctively that something was wrong. But by the time he pieced together the connections, the trap would already be closing. Sidwell's revenge was not loud, it was surgical. And it was only just beginning. The question now wasn't whether Sonny could survive Sidwell's retaliation, but whether he could do so without destroying everything he had left. The real war was not fought in the streets of Port Charles but in the living rooms, the bedrooms, the quiet moments between people who once trusted each other. As Sidwell moved his pieces across a chessboard only he could see, Sonny's greatest threat was no longer the man himself, it was the decay of everything he believed was unbreakable. And as love twisted into weaponry and secrets ripened into betrayal, Port Charles stood on the edge of a reckoning none of them were prepared to face. Finally, as Rick Lansing grew increasingly fixated on Elizabeth Baldwin, his actions took on a more obsessive and controlling tone, signaling a dangerous return to the manipulative patterns that once defined him. His quiet jealousy, disguised as romantic interest, had begun morphing into something darker, especially as Elizabeth found herself emotionally overwhelmed by the chaos erupting around her.